You think you've slept rough? Try drifting off in sub-zero temperatures with no bed, no blanket, and nothing but a reindeer skin, a burning fire, and the breath of a dozen other people to keep you warm. The Viking world was brutal. The nights were long, the winters were deadly, but somehow they rested, recovered, dreamed, without Tempur-Pedic foam, without down pillows, without central heating. They didn't just survive the night, they mastered it, because to a Viking, sleep was survival. It was the only time your sword hand dropped, the only time you let your guard down. And in a world of wolves, raids, and dark gods watching through the storm, even that was dangerous. But the Vikings had a system, a method, a way of sleeping, forged through generations that worked in some of the coldest, darkest, most merciless places on Earth. And modern science is only just catching up to it. Want to know how they did it? How a medieval warrior slept better than you in your $2,000 mattress? Then step into the smoke, into the straw, into the dark silence of the Viking longhouse, and discover how they hacked sleep without ever touching a bed. Part 1. The cold that could kill. The Viking world didn't fall asleep quietly. When night fell in 9th century Scandinavia, it didn't just get dark, it got deadly. Temperatures dropped below freezing before the sun even disappeared behind the fjords. The wind swept across the North Atlantic, knifing through every crack in the longhouse walls. It wasn't rare for snow to drift inside, even with the door shut. And outside, wolves prowled, bears stirred, and sometimes other men, armed, hungry, and watching, waited until the firelight dimmed. But none of that mattered if the cold got to you first. Where warmth meant life. For the Vikings, sleep wasn't a luxury, it was a risk. The cold didn't just make things uncomfortable, it could kill you. A single winter night in the wrong conditions meant frostbite, hypothermia, or slow death by exposure. And this wasn't once or twice a year. This was months of frozen nights with no insulation, no glass windows, and barely any bedding. So they adapted. Not with more comfort, but with strategy. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a shelter, it was a weapon against the cold. A living furnace. Imagine this, a long, narrow building up to 75 feet long, packed with people, animals, fire, and breath. The walls were made of timber, sod, or wattle and daub, stuffed with moss or animal hair to block the drafts. There were no windows, just smoke holes and slats that could be blocked during storms. But the real secret? Body heat. Vikings didn't sleep alone. That was for the rich or the dead. In a longhouse, sleep was communal, crowded, sometimes over a dozen people packed in side by side, huddled in shared warmth, wrapped in cloaks, pressed between family members, warriors, elders, and even slaves. The longhouse itself worked like a giant living body, pulsing with heat from the central hearth, breathing through the smoke hole above, and protected by thick, organic walls designed to trap what little warmth there was. It wasn't cozy, it was tactical. The fire never slept. In Viking homes, the fire didn't just warm you, it kept you alive. Central hearths burned through the night, carefully tended by whoever drew the short straw. Ashes were piled to insulate coals. Wood was rationed. Sometimes dried dung was used when timber was scarce. But flames were dangerous too. One stray ember could ignite the thatched roof. One gust of wind and you could lose your only source of heat. And so, one person was often awake, guarding the fire, guarding the sleepers. Because if the fire died, so did you. You slept beside livestock, chickens, goats, sheep, even calves. These weren't just farm animals, they were space heaters. During harsh winters, livestock were brought inside the longhouse, penned near sleeping areas. Their bodies added warmth. Their breath, thick with steam, helped lift the temperature above freezing. The smell? Unbearable by modern standards. But to the Vikings, it was the smell of survival. No beds, no blankets, just strategy. The Hollywood version of Viking beds, plush furs, thick pelts, and roaring fires, is a fantasy. Real Vikings didn't have blankets as we think of them. Instead, they slept wrapped in cloaks, often the same ones they wore during the day, sometimes with added layers of hide, wool, or reindeer skin. Beds were rare. Most common folk slept on raised wooden platforms or directly on straw or rush mats, laid out across the dirt floor or on low benches. The straw helped insulate from the frozen ground. It was itchy, it crawled, it didn't last long, but it worked. And in the darkness, you weren't looking for luxury. you were looking to wake up in the morning. The psychology of the longhouse night. The longhouse wasn't quiet at night. There were coughs, whispers, crying children, muffled prayers to Odin or Freyr, the wet sound of someone chewing dry meat, the shift of straw as a sleeper rolled over, and the ever-present fear that someone or something was listening from just outside. The Norse believed in spirits that walked in the night, draugr, ghosts, shapeshifters, witches. Sleep was never fully safe. That's why many warriors slept with their weapons nearby, a shield within arm's reach, a seax under the hay. Even while resting, a Viking remained half aware, one eye closed, the other half open, because sometimes the cold wasn't the worst thing that might wake you. And still, they slept. Despite everything, the cold, the noise, the fear, Vikings managed to sleep. Their bodies adapted, their minds hardened, their techniques evolved, because in the morning they had work to do. Fields to plow, iron to forge, children to raise, raids to plan. Sleep wasn't an escape from Viking life. It was part of the fight to stay alive. This was the Viking night. It didn't care if you were tired. It didn't care if you were sick. It didn't even care if you were young or old. It just came, freezing, endless, and full of teeth. And if you weren't ready for it, it would take you in your sleep. Part 2. The Sleep Code. How Viking rest was scheduled, shared, and sacred. We tend to think of sleep as something personal, quiet, private, peaceful. But to the Vikings, sleep wasn't personal. It was communal, structured, and sometimes even sacred. Segmented sleep, a lost human rhythm. Most of us today sleep in one big chunk, 7 or 8 hours straight if we're lucky. But that's not how our ancestors, or the Vikings, did it. In the longhouse, Viking sleep was often broken into 2 phases, the first sleep and the second sleep. These phases were divided by 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, sometimes used to stir the fire, feed livestock, whisper, pray, or even make love. It wasn't just normal, it was expected. Historical studies and Norse literature suggest this pattern was deeply ingrained. Even medieval references speak of first sleep as common knowledge. It turns out, this is how human beings are wired. Modern science confirms, in darkness our natural rhythm splits. It's artificial light that merged our sleep into one block. But in the longhouse, where night was total and fire was king, the Viking body knew what to do. It slept like it evolved too. Sleep was a social arrangement. Inside the Viking longhouse, you didn't choose where you slept. That decision was based on status, duty, and family role. The head of the household, typically the male chieftain or farmer, slept closest to the hearth, where the heat was strongest. His wife often slept beside or across from him, sometimes in a slightly raised curtained area for modesty called the set stalker. Children were nearby, warriors and farmhands farther out, slaves and thralls near the door, or animals. Proximity to the fire meant survival, so where you slept reflected who you were and how much you mattered. Rotations and duties at night. Sleep wasn't a time off from responsibility. In some homes, especially in winter, night duties were assigned. One person might be in charge of tending the fire, another listening for animals or raiders. A mother might rise to nurse or calm a crying child. A warrior might stand silent near the door, hand on axe just in case. The longhouse never fully slept. Someone was always half awake, always aware, because the price of rest was vigilance. Dreams meant something. The Vikings didn't just sleep, they believed in what happened while they slept. Dreams were seen as messages, from gods, from the dead, or from fate itself. The sagas are full of characters who dream of ravens, blood, wolves, or storms, and wake knowing battle is coming. A bad dream wasn't brushed off. It was interpreted. It could change plans, halt a raid, delay a voyage. Some even believed the soul left the body during sleep, flying through the night to receive wisdom or warnings. And if you died in your sleep, some believed your soul had simply chosen not to return. What you slept with mattered. Vikings didn't have teddy bears or sound machines, but what they slept with was still significant. Warriors might sleep beside their weapons, not just for safety, but for honor. Children might hold carved charms or bones passed down by family. Elders sometimes slept beside sacred objects, pieces of the land, ancestral heirlooms, Thor's hammer amulets. These weren't comfort items, they were spiritual tools. meant to protect the sleeper or prepare them in case they didn't wake. The longhouse night was a ritual. Over time, even basic routines became ritual. The closing of the door, the stirring of the fire, the laying out of cloaks and straw, the final prayer to the gods, the long silence before breath slowed and eyes closed. In the darkness, nothing moved except the fire and the mice. And though the longhouse was packed, somehow the silence felt infinite. Because in those hours under that roof, pressed between bodies, fur, smoke, and wood, the Viking world fell into rhythm. A shared rhythm. Of warmth, of danger, of sleep that didn't just recharge the body, but prepared the soul. And when dawn broke, pale, blue, and bitter, the Viking sleepers rose not rested, but ready. Ready for battle, for work, for the storm. Ready because they had slept like their ancestors did. Not softly, not privately, but together and by design. Part 3, no blankets, no problem, Viking hacks for heat. Imagine this. It's minus 20 degrees Celsius outside. Snow pushes up the longhouse walls. The fire's burned low. And you, with no mattress, no blanket, no electricity, still need to sleep through the night and not die. That was reality for the Viking people. But what sounds impossible to us was just another night to them. Because the Vikings, unlike Hollywood's fur-draped warriors lounging in gold-trimmed beds, didn't rely on luxury. They relied on knowledge. Wool, the miracle fiber. First line of defense, wool. Sheep were central to Viking life, not just for meat, but for insulation. Viking wool wasn't soft merino. It was thick, coarse, and perfect for trapping heat even when wet. Blankets were rare, but woolen cloaks, tunics, leggings, and hoods, standard sleepwear. These garments were slept in, sometimes layered, sometimes shared, like a living sleeping bag. No one stripped down to pajamas. You wore your warmth to bed. And for warriors on the move, a woolen cloak was your only blanket, tent, and coat all at once. Lose it, and you didn't sleep, you froze. Animal skins, nature's insulation. If you were lucky or wealthy enough, you might also have reindeer or bear pelts. These furs were prized for their insulating power, but they weren't just thrown on top like a modern comforter, they were laid beneath you to lift your body off the cold ground, or wrapped tightly around the core, like cocooning. Viking children and elders often slept nested inside sheepskin or deerskin wraps, sometimes bound with leather straps to keep out drafts. And yes, it was common to share. 2 people could share one large pelt. That wasn't affection, that was survival. Straw bedding, primitive, effective. No beds? That's not entirely true. Vikings did raise themselves off the floor, just not the way you think. They used straw, rushes, hay, and even dried moss. Stuffed into sacks or layered directly onto the wooden sleeping platforms built along the walls of the longhouse. These beds weren't soft, but they provided 2 essential things. First, separation from the freezing floor. 2, a dry buffer that trapped body heat. Wealthier families added animal skins over straw for extra warmth. And during colder months, fresh straw was replaced frequently, not for luxury, but to prevent rot, fleas, and sickness. The idea was simple. Don't heat the house, insulate the body. Central hearth, the sleeping lifeline. At the heart of every Viking longhouse was a long, narrow fire pit running through the center. This fire burned constantly in winter, tended through the night in shifts. The smoke vented partially through a roof hole, which meant the air stayed smoky, yes, but warm. Those who slept closest to the hearth, usually the family's elders, infants, or leaders, got the most heat. But even those farther out benefited from the shared body heat and radiating warmth trapped inside the wooden frame. The fire wasn't cozy ambiance, it was the difference between life and death. No blankets, but no drafts either. One of the genius elements of the Viking longhouse? Its insulation strategy, thick turf walls, layered sod roofs, tight wood joins sealed with moss and clay. Vikings weren't trying to make a house look nice. They were trying to trap warmth like a cave, and they succeeded. Once the heat from the hearth, bodies, and clothing saturated the interior, the warmth stayed in. Unlike stone castles, which lost heat rapidly, Viking longhouses were built like thermoses. They didn't need blankets, they built rooms that stayed warm without them. Sleeping together was the heat source. Perhaps the most powerful heating method of all? Other people? Sleeping in groups wasn't just cultural, it was thermodynamic strategy. One human body at rest emits around 100 watts of heat. 10 people? A kilowatt of body warmth, the same as a space heater. Vikings slept shoulder to shoulder even in families of 10 to 20 people. Yes, it was cramped. Yes, it was noisy. But it meant shared heat, regulated breathing, and, in cold months, survival. Feathers for the few. Goose feather stuffed mattresses and down blankets did exist, but they were rare and reserved for the ultra-wealthy. A noble chieftain's wife or visiting dignitary might sleep on a feather-filled bed sack, but 99% of Vikings slept on straw, wood, fur, and wool, and they slept just fine. Final layer, toughness. And finally, the Vikings had one last layer against the cold, resilience. They were raised from birth to be comfortable in discomfort. To sleep in the cold was to train the body. It was mental and physical adaptation, forged by culture, hardship, and pride. And that made them capable of sleep under stars, under snow, or even beside the frozen sea. You might call it suffering. They called it life. So no, they didn't need a duvet. The Vikings had fire, fur, flesh, and a furnace of willpower that kept them warm in the coldest nights. Part 4. Dreams, Death, and the Gods Who Watched You Sleep. To us, sleep is rest. To the Vikings, sleep was something else entirely. It was a crossing, a space between worlds where gods whispered, spirits wandered, and a man's fate could be stolen before he ever woke up. In the Viking worldview, you didn't just sleep, you descended into another realm. Dreams were more than dreams. For the Norse, a dream wasn't random brain static. It was a vision, a warning, a message, sometimes from the gods, sometimes from your ancestors, and sometimes from something darker. They called it Draumar, and not all Draumar were welcome. A peaceful dream could be a good omen. A chaotic one might mean your death was coming, or that you had been cursed. Men would wake up trembling, children would speak in strange voices, seers would be summoned to interpret what was seen in the night. And sometimes, the dream wasn't about you at all. It was a glimpse of someone else's doom. The sagas are full of dream prophecies, warriors foretelling their own deaths or receiving visions of entire villages consumed by fire. Sleep wasn't just physical rest, it was a spiritual event. The sleeper was vulnerable. To fall asleep was to be exposed, not just to the cold, but to supernatural forces. Your soul, the Norse believed, could leave the body during sleep. They called it the hugr, your mind-soul, your consciousness, your dreaming self. While your body slept, your hugr could wander, visit other people, appear in their dreams, even spy or attack. But if your hugr didn't return, you might never wake, and worse, something else might take your place. Elves, spirits, and the dead. The longhouse wasn't empty at night. Even when every person was asleep, others walked among them. The Norse believed in spirit beings, some helpful, some hostile, who were most active while humans slept. These included elves, alfar, powerful, unseen beings who could bless or curse. Draugr, undead revenants, who rose from burial mounds to torment the living. Disir, female ancestral spirits who watched over the household. Landvedir, the spirits of the land itself, sensitive to disrespect or imbalance. These weren't myths. These were real presences in the Viking mind. Sleeping alone, unprotected, disrespected the dead or the gods. You might not wake up the same, or at all. Spiritual protections in the night. So how did they guard themselves? Not with locks, but with rituals. Before sleep, many Viking households practiced sacred customs, marking doorways with runes for protection, whispering prayers to Thor or Freya, laying weapons within arm's reach even while resting, burning sacred herbs like juniper or mugwort to drive away dark spirits. Some believed sleeping in the same place every night invited spirits to grow too familiar, so they rotated spots, especially when illness struck. The bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a threshold between the world of the living and the unseen. Seers and dreamwalkers. Certain individuals were gifted, or cursed, with more vivid sleep visions. These were the vulvas, Norse seeresses, or those trained in satyr, a magical trance practice often associated with dreams, prophecy, and even spiritual travel. Some could induce dream states on command, Others were known to collapse into sudden sleep and awaken with news of battles that hadn't happened yet. The line between dream and destiny was thin, and for those who crossed it regularly, sleep was a form of witchcraft. Death in sleep was honorable, or terrifying. Not all deaths in sleep were peaceful. If a warrior died in bed, not on the battlefield, he risked being denied Valhalla. But there were exceptions. If your death came with signs, omens, or dreams, it might be seen as a calling by the gods. And sometimes, dying in sleep wasn't accidental. Warriors, especially old ones, sometimes chose to die sleeping, after sacred rituals and farewells. They would lay down fully armed, dressed for the afterlife, and drift into darkness. Not with fear, but with readiness. Burials reflect beliefs about sleep. Even in death, the Vikings treated the body as if it still slept. Corpses were washed, dressed, posed often curled in a fetal or resting position. They were given beds made of straw and fur, blankets, personal items. Why? Because in their belief, the dead didn't just vanish. They slept in the grave waiting for judgment, for rebirth, or for the end of days. Some even said the dead could dream, which meant the way you slept in life mattered in death. So the next time you drift off, ask yourself, what do you invite into your sleep? What spirits walk among your dreams? And what would the Vikings think if they saw you sleeping, vulnerable, unaware without a sword by your side? Part 5. Sleeping with the Enemy. How Vikings slept through raids, battles, and blood feuds. In the Viking Age, a man could die not just with a sword in his hand, but with his back turned, eyes closed, asleep. Because sleep wasn't just about warmth or comfort, it was about trust, and trust was a rare thing. Sleeping in enemy territory. The Vikings were raiders, explorers, traders, always moving, always risking. Whether they were camped along a riverbank in Francia, sheltered in a conquered village, or even wintering in a rival jarl's hall, they had to sleep, and that meant exposing themselves to strangers, spies, assassins. You might rest beside a man who just lost his brother to your blade, or in a longhouse whose owner once swore vengeance against your clan. One mistake, one night too deep in sleep, and you'd never wake again. Strategic sleep in a violent society. Viking sleep wasn't peaceful. It was planned, watched, layered with strategy. In war camps, men slept in rotating shifts, always someone awake, always someone armed. They often slept in their gear, not full armor, but weapons within reach. Swords laid flat, axes resting under fur pelts, shields as pillows. Many longhouses even had trapdoors under the sleeping benches, where weapons or food could be hidden in case of attack. Even children were taught, if you hear boots, reach for the blade. Shifting sleep, shifting trust. Trust was never permanent. Alliances were fragile, blood feuds ran deep, and a host's hospitality didn't guarantee your safety. Viking warriors often refused to sleep in the same spot 2 nights in a row. Others would fake sleep, waiting silently in the dark to see who moved, who whispered, who reached for a knife. Some even booby-trapped their bedding or slept with iron keys or amulets, protective symbols believed to ward off betrayal or sudden attack. Betrayal while sleeping, a Viking nightmare. And yet, sometimes it wasn't enough. The sagas are full of bloody betrayals during the night. One famous tale, the chieftain Kjartan Olafsson, betrayed while he slept under the roof of a supposed ally, murdered in his bed while unarmed. Another, the Blood Eagle, a legendary punishment said to be performed on a sleeping or captured enemy. Their ribs spread like wings while they still breathed. Even family members weren't safe. If honor demanded it, vengeance could strike in the middle of the night. The custom of guest rights and its limits. There was a sacred code. The Norse called it gestur sin, guest friendship. If a man offered you his roof, he promised protection. If you accepted, you promised peace. But this code could be bent, twisted, even broken. If someone had wronged your family, if a blood debt had not been paid, that truce could end the moment your eyes closed. So Vikings learned to read a room, not for warmth, but for motive. Who was watching? Who was whispering? Who wasn't eating their stew? Sleep on a ship, with death beneath your feet. Even at sea, Vikings had to rest, but the longship was no palace, no privacy, no walls, just a wooden hull, open sky, and rolling waves. Men slept in shifts, curled between rowing benches, wrapped in cloaks slick with salt. No fires, no softness, just cold wind and creaking timber. One man rested, another rode, another watched the horizon. Sleep here meant placing your life in the hands of your crew. If they mutinied, betrayed you, or fell asleep on watch, the whole ship could be lost. Family ties and blood feuds. In Viking society, family was everything. But even that wasn't safe. Cousins killed cousins, brothers turned on brothers. And if your father had dishonored another clan, the debt was inherited, which meant you might sleep beside a man who'd spent years waiting for the chance to avenge a slight you didn't even commit. They called it blood revenge. And it could fall like an axe in the middle of the night. When justice struck at night. In the Viking legal system, if someone was declared fjorbagsgarder, outlawed, they could be killed at any time. No trial, no negotiation. If they slept under your roof and you didn't kill them, you were guilty too. That made sleep a legal trap, and outlawed men rarely rested easy. They fled from hut to hut, hid in forests, slept with a dagger in their chest wraps, always waiting. So how did they sleep at all? The answer, like survivors, light sleepers, hardened nerves, total awareness. They didn't sleep despite the danger, they slept because of it. A Viking who couldn't rest, couldn't fight, and a Viking who couldn't fight, died. So they trained their bodies, their minds, their instincts. Even in sleep, they were half awake, alert to sounds, changes in breath, the creak of a door, or the scrape of boots. It wasn't comfort, it was combat rest. And it worked. So while you scroll in bed wrapped in layers of blankets and silence, remember this. The Vikings didn't just conquer the world awake, they survived it in their sleep. One eye closed, one hand on the hilt, heart still ready for war.